there's so many things that have to fall in line for that to be the main focus of your gym. And for a place like your place, you know, whether it's Henzo's or where you're at now in Puerto Rico, it relies on someone like you. And it's these conversations I've had with Gordon, I had it with Craig. There's only one John Danaher, and I don't know how you recreate that. That's what's crazy. It's like no one wants to be you. It's too hard. Like, no one wants to be a guy that's there 7 days a week, that trains the martial arts, the mixed martial arts classes, trains the jiu-jitsu classes, trains striking, trains them in grappling, and then goes and watches tape and studies like wrestling matches from the 80s and tries to figure out some new move. And you don't have a family, and you don't have other obsessions. You have a singular obsession with making these athletes the very best possible. I don't know how you do it, and I don't know how you do it without straying. I don't know how you do it where you're 7 days a week, completely obsessed. It has to be your mind, your personality, your like what the way you interface with martial arts is very unusual. To recreate that, you would require so much of a person. You're this weirdo that like was in like if you were a character in a movie, I would go, yeah, good luck finding someone like that. Like, there's not a lot of you out there. So for another team to be in the same space as you guys, to have the same sort of success ratio and to have the same sort of mindset, you need a guy like you. You need a guy who was teaching philosophy at Columbia, who just decides to get obsessed with jiu-jitsu. Like, how many of those are there? You need a guy who's like fully, completely dedicated to making his athletes the very best in the world, but also does it with a quiet intelligence. The way you even coach is different. Like, you're a very weird guy. I hope you know that. You're here with a fucking rash guard on. We're not rolling. Why do you have a rash guard on? But you wear rash guards every day. You understand. It's very hard to make a John Danaher. So you've raised the bar to this very bizarre and impossible standard.
A big part of it is I'm just by nature a curious person. I just think that we have a short time here on this earth, and accumulating knowledge and about the world around us is just it's a huge part of what makes us human. And people that aren't innately curious about the world in which they live are usually not very interesting people. But as far as martial arts go, I think that all human beings have a kind of innate response to martial arts that comes out of our biological history. We grow up in a highly competitive world, and human life is this kind of strange mix between competition and cooperation. There's limited resources out there and a growing population, and inevitably there's going to be conflict as people go into competition with each other. The earliest forms of competition between humans were probably empty-handed, and then as weapons become employed, primitive weapons, and then as we got more and more sophisticated, the weapons got more and more sophisticated. But somewhere deep in our collective history, there's this sense that it's important to know how to stand up for yourself physically, and if you can't do that, you're not going to survive in a competitive world. So all of us, I think, in some kind of deeply buried part of our mind can see martial arts and say, this has some kind of innate appeal. It appeals to something very, very deep inside all of us that comes out of our ancestral history. But at the same time, unrestricted violence is a terrible, terrible thing. And no society can function with unrestricted violence. Human progress is impossible without it. And so we find as humans have to acknowledge that in a competitive world, violence is part of our world, but that unrestricted violence is just as damaging as being a complete pacifist in a world of murderers. And so martial arts is the ideal of structured violence, where you learn the techniques that can make you safe in a competitive world, but they're put into a socially acceptable framework where you're not harming the people around you. You're involved in competition, but in a way which is not going to terribly injure you, either yourself or the person you're competing against. The violence, as it were, is reduced and made socially acceptable, part of it's taken to a level where it could be part of a functioning society. And if practiced, I sincerely believe makes for a better society, because it makes people acknowledge we are in a competitive world, that not all people in this world are good-hearted, and that at some point you've got to be able to stand up for yourself. And if you can't, you don't want to be a saint in a world of murderers. You're not going to do well. Okay, but on the other hand, you don't want to be a murderer in a world of saints. You can't have that. And so martial arts, as it were, is the compromise between cooperation and competition. It gives you the ability to compete all the way down to physical violence, but at the same time, it takes the violent aspect of martial arts and puts it into socially acceptable competition, socially acceptable structures that results in a population of people. If you had an entire society who practiced martial arts, so for example in Japan, everyone does judo in high school, you have a group of people who can stand up for themselves and compete physically in a potentially dangerous world, but at the same time they're socially cohesive and they're not using violence in a negative, destructive, antisocial fashion where they're harming people and stealing property or what have you. And I believe that's the greatest virtue of martial arts for society, is that it finds that balance between humanity's basic fact that we live in a competitive world where there's limited resources and growing populations, where physical violence is always going to be the ultimate method of determining who wins in competition for those limited resources. And at the same time, doesn't mean we degenerate into a violent culture where no human or civil progress is possible because we're at each other's throats 24/7. And that I see as being the great social benefit of martial arts. So even someone like me who came from an academic background can look at martial arts and see that's an important thing. That could be a great benefit both to individuals and to the society in which they live.